Hi everyone, and thank you for listening to today's Q&A. Today we've got Dave Foord with us from ASICS Training, and this Q&A is in response to a great article written on Dave's blog about Moodle and just some of the various issues that are coming up at the moment. So we thought it would be a good time just to quickly have a look at some of those issues and maybe explore some of the key areas within that article. So Dave, I was just wondering if you'd be happy to give us an introduction, please.
Okay, yeah, welcome. So my background is teaching. I was actually a PE teacher in an FE college, and I've used technology very effectively within my learning throughout. I've worked freelance since sort of 2016, and I've worked with various organisations. And in the last few years, because when I first set up, a lot of my work was about training. So I was going into places to do training on all sorts of things to do with learning technology. But in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, the work's really changed. So it's become mainly sort of Moodle focused. And I'm sort of working either as a consultant or developing resources or doing training or just simply managing a Moodle environment on behalf of a client because they don't have, for example, an e-learning manager or similar within the organization. So I work with I've got about 15 clients that I'm actively working with at the moment, both nationally and internationally. And it ranges across charities, sports governing bodies, government organisations, private sector, quite a wide gambit of organisations.
Brilliant, thanks Dave. And we've worked with you for quite some time now, and we've been doing a lot of training with you as well, and that's been really helpful for our clients. And so just to go through one of the first questions that I've got, there's a lot of alternatives out there. So there's Teams and Google Classroom and Canvas, for example. So what would you say the differences between those other alternatives and Moodle are?
So I see Moodle as really being kind of like the king of VLEs. The way it works, obviously, it's open source, and the code has been contributed to by thousands of people all over the globe through both the core code and then what you have is the plugins. And by having all of these extra plugins, it's like having a toolbox, but then being able to go down and choose a whole selection of tools that you put into that toolbox to make the toolbox more useful, effectively. And you have an almost infinite combination of options that can be applied. And as I mentioned, I've probably support 15 or so Moodles at the moment. All of them look completely different to each other. Okay, none of them look the same. They all have a different combination of options, and they've been themed differently. So when I show this to people go, "Are you sure that doesn't look like Moodle?" Because they will have been used to just using one within their organisation. They therefore think that all Moodles look like theirs. They don't realise that you can have all these different options. So I see that with that combination in the right hands is extremely powerful, and that's obviously what I do in my work. But not everybody has the time and the passion and the experiences to be able to necessarily do that. Something like Google Classroom. Now, when Google Classroom first came out, I remember its very first promotional video, and it talked about pushing content to learners. So their initial impact or their initial focus was the idea that teachers push things to learners, which unfortunately is what a lot of teachers do. And what they do with their VLE is they just upload files and for the learners to consume. And Google Classroom kind of basically tapped into that, and they made that process easier. Now, the VLE shouldn't be about just pushing files. It should be about integration and interaction between the teacher and the students and students and students. Now, although Google Classroom has evolved over time to allow more of those things to happen, and some of the Google suite I think is amazing. I've been using Google products for years. I think they're absolutely wonderful, but I still get the feeling that its underlying ethos is the notion of a teacher pushing content to the learners, which I think lends itself to the school sector more so than, let's say, FE and HE within the UK. That's sort of my take on Google Classrooms. So if you're in a school, Google Classroom, it works great. If you're in a college or university, it might work, but I think you kind of need more of the interaction options that it doesn't currently have. Teams, I've not really used it in the way as in some people are starting to use it as an alternative to a VLE. It's very much based around the communication mechanism, which in education is a good thing, because I believe that education starts with a conversation. That's a kind of a quote from one of the Greek philosophers, I forget which one. But it doesn't have the tracking and it doesn't have the functionality. It doesn't have the quiz functionality, which to me is kind of like one of the key elements of Moodle that I use extensively to A, check for the understanding, and B, using it as a mechanism for as part of the learning process, so giving them feedback. So without that, I would struggle with a VLE, and Teams doesn't currently have that. So it can do some of the other stuff, the sharing of the files, the ability to have the kind of your online classrooms, your webinar type things. That actually works quite well, but it doesn't have the full functionality, and I don't believe that it is. Well, it isn't a VLE. So some people are using it instead of a VLE, and that's fine, but they shouldn't say that it is a VLE. My view is you should use it hand in hand with whatever you're using, Moodle or something else. Now, Canvas has obviously come relatively new kid on the block and has gained ground in what I thought was a pretty saturated market. So credit to them for achieving what they've done. Their main selling point is the simplicity of the interface. That's what has attracted people to it. A lot of people don't use the full functionality of Moodle, and it becomes a little bit cluttered, and that becomes difficult both for the learner and for the teacher. So having the simpler interface of Canvas for them is attractive. For me, I would struggle not having the full level of functionality that I've become used to over the last sort of 10, 15 years that I've been working with Moodle, for example. And I know that there are a lot of other people who are in a similar situation. And I don't have a problem. I'm not sort of wanting to pick on Canvas, but it works out, as far as I can ascertain from conversations with people, a more expensive option than Moodle. So people are paying more money for a less powerful system. And to me, that seems like a false economy going forwards, but that's one of those decisions. And then the other option is obviously Blackboard, which is well established, but not many people are switching from things like Moodle to Blackboard. If you're already with Blackboard, that's a different conversation. It's obviously a commercial system. It's mainly in the HE sector within the UK, obviously quite big in America and Europe to a certain extent. But Blackboard and Moodle have kind of gone in different directions to each other, and some people will love Blackboard and some people will love Moodle, but I don't think many people will change between the two now that both are so established.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Dave. That's a brilliant highlight of the various different options that are out there. We love Moodle over at Software because we're an open source company, so we love it when there's an open source option. And obviously the benefit of Moodle is that there's no vendor lock-in. You can move your Moodle around and it's just brilliant. So we definitely see those strengths as well. Just going back to something that you mentioned, which was how extensible Moodle is with the various different plugins. Is there a set of plugins or a few different plugins that you'd recommend for other people's Moodle as a starting point?
I mean, absolutely. And one of the first things that an organization should be doing is going through and looking at which plugins you install. A straightforward out of the box Moodle with just the core plugins is okay, but you really need to put some others in, and it will be different for different organizations. When I take on a new client, I tend to have a sort of a long list of my preferred plugins, which I'll get installed whether I think they need them or not, just because I like them and I think that they will come in useful at some point. It's just easier to install them all up front. One of the key areas for me, as I mentioned earlier, is the quiz tool, which I think is very powerful. You've got a set of core question types already, but there are additional question types that are not core. You've got the gap fill question type, I think is excellent. The OU multiple response is much easier to use than the multiple choice if you're doing multiple response questions. And you've got the drag and drop images and drag and drop markers. Some of those I think have become core. I forget which ones have become core, but they're really useful. In terms of the appearance, you've got course formats. I quite often use the grid format with clients. People seem to like that. You've also got the collapsed topics format. There's tiles, which can be quite useful. So again, having a variety of formats, so you're not just stuck with topics and weekly and things like that, is worth having. You obviously need to have a theme. So there's the boost theme, which is kind of like the standard one. I've been using Adaptable for the last few years because it allows me as a sort of a front-end admin to make changes. But I've also, for a couple of projects recently, I've started using something called Move. That's Moove. which I'm finding is also quite a nice one. So I'm tending to use Boost, Move, and Adaptable are kind of my three go-to themes, depending on the requirements. And then there's a whole load of really good activity types. The journal activity is a really, really simple activity, which I wish it was core. Dead easy for your teacher to use, really good for testing understanding at the end of a topic, so I will recommend that. The dialogue activity is used for one-to-one conversations. Again, that just seems to be a really sensible option. Again, it would be great if it was core. You've got things like the OU blog, which is like a blog activity, and you can have multiple blogs within a course. I think it works better than the built-in blog function, which is kind of like a site-wide blog rather than a course level blog. The questionnaire is similar to the feedback, but it has a different and a wider range of question options. So I will tend to use, sometimes I'll use questionnaire, sometimes I'll use feedback. There's something called H5P, which is kind of like interactive activities. Now, I believe that has become core in the latest version of Moodle. I think it's core in 3.9. But if you're on an earlier version, it's a plugin, and it allows you to create a wide range of different interactivities. When H5P first came out, I was a little bit skeptical. The kind of lower level than, let's say, the quiz tool in Moodle. But what they do is they allow you to embed what you create into other items. So I might have, let's say, a Moodle book which has content, but I just want to ask one question. I can embed an H5P activity question into the book. So the student doesn't have to leave the book. They just answer the question and they move on. That is very, very powerful. And that's only become possible relatively recently. And one of the activity types that H5P offers is interactive video. Okay, for me, with my PE and sports background, okay, this is just like brilliant. I wish I'd had that when I was teaching. Have a video, play part the video, stop it, ask them a question, play a bit more video, stop it, ask a question. That is really, really powerful as a teaching tool and a learning tool. So that's kind of a synopsis of some of the key things. The other thing, I suppose, is making it easier for students to track their progress. There's the completion progress block, which is quite attractive. There's also the checklist activity, which can be useful for tracking how far people are through, so that learners know what the progress is and things like that. So,
Thanks, Dave. They sound like some really good plugins, and there's a few that we often use as well. We love the Mood theme here as well. We've installed that on quite a few sites, as it seems to be a default pick nowadays as well, because it's a really nice looking theme. I really like what you mentioned with H5P with the new interactive video. That's really interesting, especially as more people are consuming videos and it's becoming really the medium of choice now. And being able to test on that is really useful.
I think with video, people think that video, because it's kind of multimedia, is therefore kind of really, really good. If you just share a video with the learners, it actually becomes very passive. They're just watching the video, and to be honest with you, quite often just sort of going off, having a snooze, especially in this modern day and age where learners are used to videos being 90 seconds, but very punchy. So if you're going to show a 5 or 10 minute video with them, it might be a really, really good content, but they'll get bored. You have to get them to do something. Okay, don't just watch this video because it's interesting. Okay, watch the video and ask them a question. And either the H5P activity is very good for that, or you can integrate it into, let's say, a discussion forum. So you have the video and then they have to answer questions in the forum, and then they can see the responses of other members of the class to see what they say. That suddenly turns your relatively passive video activity into a much more engaging and educationally high merit activity.
Definitely, I mean, that sounds perfect, and there's some really good tips to using video with e-learning. So moving on from the plugins but still connected, how can people most effectively use their Moodle during the current crisis and increase usage? With more people moving to remote learning, are there some quick wins that can be put in place to make a Moodle more effective?
I think, the quick wins is obviously, certainly in March when education was pushed into shutdown at relatively short notice. We kind of all knew it was coming, but when it actually came, it kind of came as a bit of a shock. People then had to do emergency learning. They didn't have a chance to plan what they were doing. They just had to do what they could with what they had. we're now going into a phase of, obviously, a second lockdown is likely to happen. Although schools and colleges and universities are exempt, I think the reality is that a lot of places, for more local reasons, are having to face the reality of locking down. My son at the moment, he's doing his A-levels. He's having to isolate at home because somebody in his year has tested positive. So the whole sixth form has just been shut down and they're all being taught remotely. The key thing with any kind of learning activities is not losing track of what the purpose of education is. A lot of teachers still think that they are the font of all knowledge and their job is to sort of get the information from their notebook into the learner's notebook, and then they've educated them. That isn't the case. We need to get learners doing something so that they are using the information that's being transferred, therefore increasing their understanding and therefore increasing their ability to use it. And that's where your kind of Bloom's taxonomy comes into play, moving up the pyramid towards the top, where you've got evaluation and analysis and those sorts of skills that come in. Just sharing a load of PowerPoints with people isn't going to necessarily achieve that. So the quick win things are, don't spend your time creating lots of presentation-y type things, whether it's PowerPoint or SCORM or something similar, but create activities where the learners do something. Now, I'm a big fan of the discussion forum because used effectively, it can be a very powerful learning tool because it's very quick to set up. Yes, it will take a little bit of time to moderate as you go through, but it can be a very powerful learning tool. You have to get good at writing the questions, because if you write a question that can just be answered yes, no, that doesn't lead for a very good discussion. So you want to ask questions that are likely to elicit a response. And that might mean, as a tutor, you actually state a point of view that you don't necessarily agree with, but you know that it's going to elicit a reaction, and then you unpick that reaction with the learners as they go forward. So I think discussion forums is a really, really good tool because it's quick to set up but very powerful. And I've already mentioned one of the obvious ways is to have a video. Okay, watch the video. I want you to then answer this question. What has the person done wrong? And what should they have done, or what would you do differently? Or watch the video and say, which psychological theory is this an example of? Okay, and why? So those sorts of activities, quite quick to set up. Embedding a YouTube or a Vimeo video is really, really easy to do. And if you embed the video, what it does is it stops, because you've embedded it, you don't have all the YouTube distractions around the outside. So you don't have the picture of the kind of the dog on a skateboard or the cat sneezing. And in my case, because it knows what things I like, I'll have videos about kind of cricket because I like cricket. So I'm watching a video and there's all these distractions on the right hand side. Do I want to watch Michael Holding bowling in 1970? Well, actually, I would quite like that. So those sorts of things. Getting the learners to do things. The glossary activity, a lot of people don't look at the glossary activity. You can set the students a task. Okay, we're doing a bit on psychology, for example. You can give each person a psychological theorist, so Freud and Pavlov, etc. And then you can say, right, I want you to research them. And they have to then enter a little bit of information about that person into the glossary, which the others can then see. And then they can comment on it and they can rate it. So in a matter of minutes, you've created quite a powerful learning activity that can have quite good responses. If you get good at the glossary activity, the next step up is something called the database activity. It's a little bit trickier to use, but it allows you to have more fields rather than just the term and the definition. And if you get really good at that, there's another plugin called Dataform, which if you really have time to work out how it works, is again quite powerful, but it's not the easiest thing to use. Although it says it's easy, it isn't. I'm using it quite a bit, but it's taken me a while to learn it. Writing quizzes is very powerful, but it takes a lot of time. If you do happen to have a bank of, let's say, multiple choice questions in a format, there are tools where you can basically quickly upload it either to the Moodle quiz or into the H5P. So if you've got it in Excel or Word, with a bit of manipulation, you can actually import it, and then it gives you at least a bank of questions much quicker than actually just typing them out, which can be quite time consuming. So I think they're the sort of the quick wins. It is something that comes with practice. It is, if you've got somebody in the organization that can offer help, it's seeking that help. Just say, look, I'm teaching this, but it's taking me ages. Have you got any ideas? Can you help me? And if you don't have somebody in the organization, it's where reaching out to people outside the organization, either to do some training sessions or getting something from outside an organization to just work with one subject area and help them develop a product, and then you've got that as an example that other people can then see to then apply to their own sort of examples.
Thanks, Dave. I really like the idea of the discussion forum. That sounds like a really quick and easy way to get some good discussion going. And it's almost like self-directed learning. It's a quick way to ask a question and then a lot of internal social discussion between the students.
And when I was teaching, I sort of have, within each week, I use the VLE quite a lot. Even though I was teaching face to face, I was using the VLE as a support mechanism. I would have a certain structure. So this topic is, I was teaching biomechanics, which is basically the physics of sport. So we'll have a topic, let's say it's force, and we'll have, here's some learning materials, here's some sort of questions that I've written, and then I would have, for each week, I would have a discussion activity where I'd actually ask a question relating to that topic. Now, some weeks, the discussion forum didn't actually get any responses, but I could check from the tracking data that they were reading it. Now, they're still, because what I was quite often doing was using that as sort of stretch and reach. So for the more able learners, the discussion question was more challenging. It was above and beyond what I had to do as the core curriculum. If they just read it and they thought about it, but they didn't respond, learning is still taking place. So it doesn't matter that they didn't respond. I still persevered. And then there were some weeks when I did get responses and we did have a discussion ensuing. And it didn't matter, as I say, whether people are lurking and just reading it, they might still be learning. But it's quite hard for teachers to keep creating forum activities if they don't actually get responses from the learners. One of the beauties of things like Moodle is you can set the tracking so that you can say, well, you have to post at least one post to reply for this to be marked as complete. And you can actually say you have to do this before you get something else. So you can actually kind of use a bit of carrot and stick to encourage them to have a contribution, but it'd be very easy for them to just put in a very sort of silly contribution just for the sake of the tick. But it can be quite powerful.
Thanks very much for that, Dave. And just moving on really now to the final question. When I was reading through your blog, and we'll make sure we put a link to that below this Q&A, and it's kind of really the main argument of your blog post was that you were saying that now is probably not the best time to move away from your Moodle. So I was just wondering if you could maybe explain the reasons and your thoughts behind that.
I mean, there's a couple of things. I'm hearing when people say, oh, we're thinking of moving, and then when they give the reasons that they're giving are not good reasons. We've just heard it's old hat, or we've heard that the college down the road have switched and therefore it must be the right thing. That's not sensible decision making in any language. The decision to move is not one to take lightly. It requires a lot of thought. You've got to think about, is what we're moving to definitely better? What is the impact going to be for the actual process of the move? It will be disruptive both for the students and for the tutors, and we've got to work out, are there going to be any negative effects, and do the positives outweigh the negatives? You've obviously got the cost implications, and it's not just the cost now, but the cost in the future. Now, if I use Canvas as an example, we don't know what their pricing model is going forwards. But what we can do is we can look back in history to what happened about 20 odd years ago when Blackboard, for example, came to the fore. They started off being very cheap, and then once people had kind of got hooked, they then put the price up because you were already committed to them. People would just pay that higher price. Now, I don't know if Canvas is going to play the same strategy as Blackboard did 20 odd years ago, but it is always a possibility. And you have to say, if that happens, are we happy to either pay that extra price or move again to something else? And they're difficult decisions. They're not easy decisions to make. And because we don't know what the pricing is, whereas with Moodle, because it's open source, we know what the pricing is. The product itself doesn't cost anything. And if one host puts the cost up, you just move to another host. As you say, it's portable. So you know that what the pricing is going to be. And to a certain extent, Google Classroom and Teams, you're in the same sort of boat. I think we're pretty confident with those that the cost of them isn't going to change because of the nature of the way the business does. It might do, but more likely. And then the second thing is we have no idea how this pandemic is going to play out, and if online learning is going to become kind of the main method of learning and face-to-face is going to become the minor element of the learning, then what you need is the most powerful system that you can get. And that is where the timing seems wrong to move away from Moodle, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the most powerful of the systems because of the unique way that you can combine all the plugins in different ways, it is, and it has to be the most powerful system. So to turn away from that, to me, it just seems like the wrong decision. Spend a bit of time and money getting somebody in to improve the appearance so that it looks better, it's easier, more user friendly. If there are features and functions in there that you don't need, then you turn them off. A lot of people don't realize, I mean, there are certain plugins. Okay, the survey plugin, which is, no, sorry, it's not plugin, it's core. There's a survey activity. I think it's totally useless, so I turn it off. Okay, there's no point in showing something to tutors that they're not going to use. And there's a few other things in there. If you're not going to use them, or you don't see a value in them, turn them off so that it simplifies the options. It keeps things simpler. Similarly, there are a whole lot of blocks which you just don't need. Okay, turn them off at admin level so that teachers don't go around adding every block under the sun and making the course look really unusable. That all makes sense. Personally, I'm a big fan of the I don't like the Atto editor, which has kind of become the default Moodle editor. I don't like it. I find it hard to use. I know some people do like it. So I tend to use the Tiny MCE editor as my preference. But what I do is I actually edit the editor so that it only shows the buttons that I want people to see. So a tutor has no need to change the font color. They have no need to change the font style because that should be set by the theme and the CSS that's behind it. So I turn it off so that tutors can't do it, okay? Because there's no point in having the option, because but if they do change it, they make the site less accessible. So that's why I turn it off. And by simplifying the options that are available, it makes it much more amenable to the tutors. So when people go, oh, I've got these 3 rows of icons and I don't know which one does which. Well, on the Moodles that I support, we have 2 rows of icons because I've got rid of about a third of them because they don't need them. And I've changed the order so that they actually are in a more logical order, in my opinion. But it's those sorts of things. Changing the language pack. People don't realize that you can go into the language pack. So where it's things like the assignments, and it says submit assignment. It might be you change the text. So rather than saying submit assignment, you can say submit for your tutor to look at, or submit for grading, or whatever. So you can actually just change various language items to make it work just more sensibly, or more sensibly for you in your situation. To use local language, if you use the word unit or module or course, well, we can change the language to reflect that at a higher level. It doesn't take much time to get these sort of things sorted. That's the thing that kind of frustrates me, is a couple of days with somebody that knows what they're doing, and you could really turn your Moodle around, and that should be a starting point. The second issue is investing time in the staff, and this is where, again, when people that are switching because Moodle's too hard to use, that's because you've not invested time in the staff. Going to another system, you've still got to invest time in the staff for them to use it effectively. And if you don't, you're going to have the same problems in 4 or 5 years' time, where whatever you've moved to isn't being used effectively. And you'll be then looking to switch in 4 or 5 years' time to something else. And you'll again be blaming the technology rather than the fact that you haven't invested in the staff. And I think we've had the same conversations with PowerPoint. People blame PowerPoint. Oh, PowerPoint. PowerPoint's a wonderful tool if you know how to use it. It's only because people haven't spent the time training people how to use it properly, and we only have to watch political briefings to realise that even at the highest level of the country, people don't use PowerPoint properly. So we set an expectation that that is what PowerPoint does, and that's again a real shame. The tool itself isn't to blame; it's the way that people use it that is to blame. And it's the same with the VLE.
Thanks very much for that, Dave. And there's some really great points that have been raised, and there's a lot worth thinking about just before moving over to another platform. So I think that's most of the content covered there. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we end the Q&A?
I think for people that are listening, with Moodle in particular, it's worth, you have various options. You can either host it yourself, perfectly viable. You can host it with another company, for example, like Overt. And then you've obviously got the Moodle partners. So people think that you have to do one of the 3. You have actually got quite a wide gambit of options, and there are advantages and disadvantages of each of the different approaches. And it's worth looking at each one critically before deciding what is the best option for you. Don't feel that just because you worked at a college where they self-hosted, if you then switch to another college, that self-hosting is the only way it can be done. There are different ways in which your hosting and the support from your host company can be managed, and it's getting that right is part of the key, I think. And in my opinion, it isn't expensive to get it right if it's done properly with the right people. Okay, it's a relatively affordable solution for the tools that it brings, but do have conversations with as many people as you can, external people like myself, who see lots of systems. We offer a lot of value, as well as speaking to the different host companies and vendors directly within the system, and just talking to your own personal networks through Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. If you work in education, you will have other people in other education establishments that you are connected to, and just get as many opinions as you can from as many people before you make a decision.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Dave. And it's been a great pleasure speaking with you today. And thank you for your time and all your valuable answers. And hopefully we'll continue with these Q&As in the new year.